Have you ever wondered what happens when the house finally falls silent, when the career that defined you ends, the partner who completed you is gone, and the children who needed you have built lives that rarely include you? This isn't just another chapter. It's an entirely new book, with blank pages waiting to be filled in a handwriting you might not recognize as your own. The silence of an empty home can feel like a weight pressing down, growing heavier with each passing hour. That ticking clock on the wall? It's no longer marking time, it's marking absence. The absence of purpose, the absence of touch, the absence of being necessary to someone else's day. But what if this silence isn't the end of your story, but rather the beginning of its most authentic chapter? Today, we're going to investigate what happens when you find yourself alone after 65. Not just how to survive it, but how to transform it into something meaningful, something dignified, something that honors not just who you were, but who you are becoming. Many of us planned our lives with certain assumptions. We saved for retirement, assuming we'd share expenses with a partner. We bought homes thinking they'd be filled with family gatherings. We imagined afternoons spent with grandchildren or evenings with friends who've known us for decades. But life rarely follows our careful blueprints. And when it doesn't, when we find ourselves standing alone in the late light of our years, what? Then this isn't a question for the distant future. Right now, millions of older adults are navigating solitude they never anticipated. Some have lost spouses after decades of partnership. Others have watched children move across the country or overseas. Many have outlived friends or found themselves suddenly alone after retirement stripped away daily connections. If you're among them, you know this territory intimately. You know how the mind can spiral in silence, how grief can arrive unexpectedly, triggered by something as simple as making coffee for one instead of two. How isolation can creep in day by day until the world feels increasingly distant. But you should also know this. The experience of being alone after 65 is not a sentence to emptiness. It can become, with intention and wisdom, a doorway to a kind of authentic living that wasn't possible before. To illustrate this, let me tell you a story. Before we continue, remember to like the video to help us continue creating content for you. Walter Green didn't expect to arrive at old age this way. He had envisioned retirement with his beloved Eleanor by his side, their days filled with ease, their home humming with the occasional chaos of grandchildren. But Eleanor's death came too soon. His children, David and Rachel, both kind and successful, lived in cities far from him, emotionally even further. And so, Walter began his retirement, not with celebration, but with silence, the silence of a house too still, of mornings that didn't begin and nights that refused to end. "I never imagined this," Walter confessed one afternoon, sitting in his small apartment, sunlight cutting sharp rectangles across the floor. All those years of planning, the retirement accounts, the downsizing. Eleanor and I talked about where we'd travel. Now there's no we anymore. Walter's days had lost their architecture. He would wake at odd hours, sometimes drifting through the apartment in a bathrobe until noon. Other times, he'd be dressed at dawn with nowhere to go. The television played constantly, not for entertainment, but for the illusion of company. His son David called weekly, conversations filled with forced cheer and updates about grandchildren. "You should get out more, Dad," he'd say, as if Walter merely needed this reminder to rejoin the world. His daughter Rachel sent care packages with vitamins and socks. Both were gestures of love, but they couldn't touch the profound aloneness Walter felt. "It's not that I don't know how to be alone," Walter explained, adjusting the photograph of Eleanor on his side table. "It's that I don't know how to be alone now, at this age, when everyone assumes you've figured it all out or that you're simply winding down. The first month after Eleanor's passing, Walter had visitors, neighbors bringing casseroles, church members offering prayers, a few colleagues from his teaching days. But gradually, as happens, they returned to their own lives. The casseroles stopped coming. The phone calls became less frequent, and Walter found himself truly alone. One Tuesday, I remember it was Tuesday because the garbage trucks were making their rounds, I realized no one had spoken my name aloud in 9 days, Walter said, his voice steady despite the weight of this revelation. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and said it myself, Walter, just to hear it in the room. It was a small moment, but it marked something significant, the recognition that his aloneness wasn't temporary. It wasn't something to simply endure until life returned to normal. This was the new normal, and he would need to find a way through it. Walter's children meant well. David would invite him to visit, but his home was busy with teenagers and career demands. During Walter's last visit, he spent most evenings alone in the guest room while the family maintained their usual rhythms. Rachel called often, but her conversations were hurried, squeezed between meetings and her children's activities. They love me, Walter acknowledged, but they're living in the middle chapters of their own stories. I can't expect them to rewrite those chapters around me. This realization that his children's love was genuine, but their capacity was limited, was both painful and liberating. It meant Walter had to stop waiting for rescue. He had to find his own way forward. The hardest part wasn't the big moments, Walter confided. Not the holidays or anniversaries. It was the small daily rituals, making coffee for one, cooking a single portion, watching the sunset with no one to turn to and say, look at that pink sky. That's what hollowed me out. The absence of witness to the ordinary. Walter's story isn't unique. It echoes the experience of countless older adults who find themselves alone after decades of connection. Some, like Walter, are widowed. Others are divorced or never married. Some have children who are present but unable to fill the particular emptiness that settles in when daily companionship ends. What makes Walter's story worth telling isn't his aloneness. It's what he chose to do with it. I remember the morning things began to shift, Walter said, his eyes brightening. I woke up feeling that weight of emptiness heavier than usual. The thought of another formless day stretched before me. But instead of turning on the television, I just sat with the feeling, really felt it, and then I asked myself, what would Eleanor want for me right now? The answer came with unexpected clarity. She would want him to live. Not just exist, but live. With intention, with dignity, with a willingness to remain open to whatever might come next. That was the morning I put on a proper shirt, one with buttons, and walked to the botanical conservatory near my apartment, Walter continued. It was something Eleanor and I had planned to do together in retirement. I decided to do it alone. The conservatory was nearly empty that weekday morning. Walter wandered through displays of orchids and ferns, feeling both out of place and strangely at home. He sat on a bench near a small fountain, watching water catch light as it fell. For the first time in months, he felt his breath deepen. Not happiness exactly, but a moment of peace, of being present. An older woman, though probably younger than me, Walter said with a small smile, nodded to me as she passed. Just a simple acknowledgement. She didn't speak, but in that tiny gesture I felt seen. It was a pinprick of light. Walter returned to the conservatory the next day, and the next. It became the foundation of a morning routine that gave shape to his days. Sometimes he brought a notebook and wrote small observations. Other times he simply sat, breathing in the humid air fragrant with soil and green life. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Walter didn't suddenly find his loneliness vanquished, but he discovered something essential. He could choose how to carry it. Loneliness isn't the absence of people, Walter reflected. It's the absence of meaning, of purpose. I couldn't replace Eleanor. I couldn't make my children closer or more available, but I could begin to create meaning again, even if it was just in small ways, even if it was just for myself. This insight became the first step in Walter's journey toward living meaningfully within his solitude. Not erasing it, but transforming it. Not filling the void with noise, but finding dignity within it. And this is where Walter's story begins to offer wisdom for anyone facing aloneness in their later years. Because what he discovered through both stumbling attempts and unexpected grace were 6 essential practices that can transform isolation into solitude, emptiness into possibility, an ending into a different kind of beginning. But before we explore these practices, it's important to acknowledge the reality. Being alone after 65 is challenging in ways that younger people cannot fully grasp. It comes with practical difficulties. Who will notice if you fall? Who will remind you to take medication? It carries emotional weight, the absence of touch, of being truly known by another. And it exists within a culture that often renders older adults invisible, particularly those without family connections. Yet within this challenge lies an invitation to discover a kind of freedom and authenticity that many never experience, to release the expectations and roles that may have defined earlier decades, to find, perhaps for the first time, your own voice, not as someone's partner or parent or colleague, but simply as yourself. I had to learn who Walter was, he explained, when he wasn't being someone for someone else, when he wasn't Eleanor's husband or David and Rachel's father or Professor Green, just Walter. It's strange to say, but in my 70s, I began to meet myself for the first time. This meeting, this honest reckoning with oneself, lies at the heart of transforming aloneness from a sentence into an opening. And it begins with small, deliberate choices that gradually reshape empty hours into meaningful days. Walter's journey from emptiness to meaning wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded gradually, through trial and error, through moments of insight followed by days of backsliding. But over time, certain practices emerged that fundamentally changed his experience of being alone. Let me share the first 3 of these essential practices with you now. Number 1, reclaim your mornings. In those first months after Eleanor died, Walter recalled, time lost all structure. Days and nights blurred together. I'd sleep until 10, then nap in the afternoon, then lie awake at 3 in the morning. There was no rhythm, no purpose to any of it. This formlessness is common when we lose the external structures that once shaped our days. Work schedules, family needs, social commitments, these create the architecture of our time. Without them, hours stretch into a featureless landscape. For Walter, reclaiming his mornings became the cornerstone of rebuilding a meaningful life. It began with that first visit to the Botanical Conservatory, a small act of intention that grew into a practice. I started setting an alarm for 7:30, he explained, not because I had to be anywhere, but because I was choosing to begin my day with purpose. I'd make coffee, real coffee, not instant, and sit by the window. Sometimes I'd read, sometimes I'd just watch the light change on the buildings across the way. This simple routine, waking at a consistent time, engaging in a deliberate morning ritual, might seem trivial, but its impact was profound. By taking ownership of the first hours of his day, Walter began to take ownership of his life again. I expanded it slowly, he continued. After coffee, I'd walk to the conservatory. I'd bring my notebook and write down 3 observations, just small things, like the pattern of a leaf or a conversation I overheard. Then I'd read a poem, just one, before heading home. Walter wasn't filling his mornings with busyness. He was creating a container for presence, for being fully awake to his life, even in its simplicity, even in its solitude. The quality of my attention changed, he noted. Instead of waking to thoughts of what was missing, I began waking to curiosity about what the day might hold. It wasn't happiness exactly, not at first, but it was engagement. And that was the beginning. This practice of reclaiming your mornings doesn't require grand plans or activities. It simply asks that you approach the first hours of your day with intention rather than reaction. That you choose how to begin rather than letting emptiness dictate your rhythm. For you, this might mean a morning walk or meditation or writing or preparing a beautiful breakfast just for yourself. The specific activity matters less than the intention behind it. The decision to start each day by claiming your right to meaning, regardless of who is or isn't beside you. Eleanor used to handle our mornings, Walter admitted. She was the early riser, the one who made plans. Learning to create my own morning was like learning a language I'd never needed before. Clumsy at first, but eventually it became fluent. This fluency, this ability to shape time rather than being shaped by its emptiness, forms the foundation for all other aspects of living meaningfully alone. Because a day that begins with intention tends to continue with purpose, even through its inevitable, difficult moments. Number 2, curate a circle of meaningful strangers. When we think about combating loneliness, our minds typically turn to family and close friends. But for many older adults living alone, these connections may be limited by distance, availability, or loss. Walter discovered that waiting for his children to fill his social needs was both unrealistic and unfair to them. David and Rachel have their own lives, Walter explained. They love me, but they can't be my primary source of connection. I needed to build something else. This something else emerged unexpectedly when Walter noticed a flyer at the public library advertising a program called Silver Hour, weekly gatherings for older adults to share stories, play games, and learn new skills. I almost didn't go, Walter confessed. The name alone made me cringe a bit. Silver Hour, like we're all just grey heads waiting to be polished up. But I made myself walk through that door the first time, just to see. What Walter found wasn't instant community or deep friendship, but it was something equally valuable, the presence of others navigating similar terrain. There was a retired surgeon named Martine who taught chess, a former librarian, Judith, who led book discussions, and Helen. Walter's voice softened at her name. Helen Carter. She organized nature walks around the city parks. Everyone had their story. Everyone had experienced some form of loss, but they were still engaging with life. Walter began attending regularly, not with the expectation of replacing what he'd lost with Eleanor, but of creating something new, something different. We weren't friends in the traditional sense, he explained. Not at first. We were more like allies, people who recognized something in each other without needing to name it. There's a comfort in that kind of recognition. This is the essence of curating a circle of meaningful strangers, finding regular, structured contact with others who share some element of your experience without the pressure of intimate friendship. It provides social connection while honoring the reality that deep relationships take time to build, especially later in life. One day, about 3 months in, a man named Thomas asked about the photo I kept in my wallet, Walter recalled. It was Eleanor on our 40th anniversary. I found myself telling him about her, not just the ending, but our whole story. He listened, really listened. When I finished, he simply said, "She sounds remarkable." 3 words, but in them, I felt Eleanor being seen and myself being heard. These small moments of recognition accumulated over time. A woman laughed genuinely at one of Walter's chess jokes. Another remembered his preference for Earl Grey tea. Helen noticed when he missed a week and called to check on him. They weren't trying to fix my loneliness, Walter emphasized. That's what made it work. We were just people showing up in the same space, bringing our whole selves, joys and sorrows alike. For you, curating a circle of meaningful strangers might look different. It could be a class at a community center, a volunteer, position, a faith community, or a hobby group. The key is consistency, showing up regularly enough that connections can gradually form, and authenticity, allowing yourself to be known, at least in small ways. What are your thoughts on this? Comment below so we can know what you think. Continuing, it's not about finding a new best friend or a replacement for what you've lost, Walter advised. It's about creating a social ecosystem where you're recognized as a full human being, where your presence matters. This practice acknowledges a fundamental truth. Humans need witness. We need to be seen and acknowledged by others. Not constantly, but regularly. Not necessarily deeply, but authentically. A circle of meaningful strangers provides this witness without the intense demands of close relationship, a gentle way to maintain social connection while honoring your need for independence. Number 3. Create a legacy project. After several months of established morning routines and regular social contact, Walter still experienced periods of profound emptiness, particularly on Sundays, the day he and Eleanor had always reserved for family meals and relaxation. Sundays were brutal, he acknowledged. I'd make it through the morning routine, maybe attend a community event, but by afternoon, this wave of purposelessness would hit. What was the point of any of it? Who would remember that I'd been here at all? This question of meaning, of legacy, of leaving some trace of yourself behind becomes particularly acute when living alone in later years. Without daily witnesses to your life, how do you know it matters? How do you create meaning that extends beyond your immediate experience? For Walter, the answer began with a leather-bound journal his daughter Rachel had given him years earlier. It had remained empty, a beautiful object with no purpose, until one particularly hollow Sunday. I sat at my small writing desk and opened that journal, Walter remembered. I wrote at the top of the first page, "Letter to my great-grandchildren." Then I paused. I don't have great-grandchildren yet. My grandchildren are still young. But I suddenly realized I didn't need actual recipients to leave something behind. Walter began writing that afternoon. Not his life story in any formal sense, but reflections, observations about love and loss, descriptions of how the light hit the conservatory's glass dome at noon, confessions about his fears and regrets, celebrations of moments that had brought him joy. I wrote about Eleanor, of course, he said, but not just about losing her, about finding her too, about the day we met at a museum where she worked as a guide and I was a nervous young teacher, bringing students on a field trip, about the way she hummed when she cooked and never followed recipes exactly. This project, these letters to future generations who might never read them, became a Sunday ritual. Each week, Walter would sit at his desk and add another entry. Some were light-hearted, describing neighborhood characters or funny incidents from his teaching days. Others were deeply reflective, exploring questions of meaning and purpose. All were honest. The strange thing was, Walter noted, I started living more attentively the rest of the week. I'd notice things and think, I want to put that in Sunday's letter. A conversation with the grocery clerk, a perfect red maple leaf on the sidewalk, the taste of the first fall apple. I was collecting moments, creating a record not just of having existed, but of having truly lived. This is the power of a legacy project. It connects you to something beyond your immediate circumstances. It creates continuity between past, present, and future. It gives purpose to your observations and experiences, even when there's no one physically present to share them with. Your legacy project might take many forms. It could be writing, as it was for Walter, but it might also be creating art, organizing family photographs with written captions, recording oral histories, quilting, gardening, mentoring, or community service. The essential quality isn't the form, but the intention. To create something that outlasts this moment, that carries some element of your unique perspective forward. I'm not writing the great American novel, Walter clarified. I'm not trying to be profound. I'm just saying, I was here. I noticed things. I loved people. I experienced this world fully, even when it broke my heart. And that feels like enough. This practice honors a deep human need to know that our lives have meaning beyond our immediate experience, that something of us continues, even if just in the form of words on a page, or seeds in a garden, or kindness passed from one person to another. Number 4, adopt a seasonal routine. As Walter established his morning practice, cultivated meaningful social connections, and developed his legacy project, he began to feel more grounded. But he also noticed a new challenge, the danger of rigid routine. There's a fine line, he observed, between having helpful structure and falling into a rut. After a few months, I realized my days had become almost identical. Mornings at the conservatory, afternoons reading or writing, evenings with the television. It was better than the formless grief of before, but something was still missing. There was no texture to time. This flatness, this sense of one day blending indistinguishably into the next, is a common experience for those living alone, particularly after retirement removes the natural variations of work life. Without different people and demands creating contrast in our days, time can begin to feel static. Walter's insight was to look beyond daily or weekly rhythms to the larger patterns of the year, to consciously align his activities with the changing seasons. I started simply, he explained. In spring, I planted basil and mint on my windowsill, not a full garden, just something small I could tend. I'd make fresh tea for anyone who visited. In summer, I began taking longer bus rides with no destination, just to see different neighborhoods, to feel the change in atmosphere. As autumn arrived, Walter added new elements to his seasonal rhythm. He took weekly walks in the park with his camera, documenting the changing colors. He gathered fallen leaves and practiced sketching them. He attended harvest festivals at local farms. Winter was hardest, Walter admitted. The cold made it difficult to get out as much, and the early darkness could feel oppressive. So I created indoor traditions, soup making on Mondays, music nights at the library on Wednesdays. I bought better lamps and rearranged my furniture to maximize natural light. This practice of aligning with the seasons did more than add variety to Walter's days. It connected him to the natural rhythms of life, to processes of growth, abundance, release, and rest that continue regardless of our personal circumstances. It provided a framework larger than himself, a reminder that change is constant and necessary. The seasons don't care if you're alone or surrounded by people, Walter reflected. They don't care if you're grieving or celebrating. They simply continue their cycle. There's something comforting in that continuity, that indifference. It helped me see that my aloneness wasn't the center of the universe. It was just one state among many, as temporary in its way as autumn or spring. For you, adopting a seasonal routine might involve different activities based on your interests, abilities, and location. The key is intentionally varying your practices throughout the year, creating distinct chapters that give texture and progression to time. This prevents the dangerous sense that days are merely accumulating without meaning or direction. I started keeping a seasonal journal, Walter shared. Just notes about what changes I noticed, what activities I was drawn to in each season. It became a way of tracking not just the passing of time, but my evolving relationship with it. I could see patterns emerging, not just in nature, but in myself. These patterns revealed something important. Walter's energy and needs fluctuated naturally throughout the year. By honoring these fluctuations rather than fighting them, he found greater ease. In winter, I need more rest, more inwardness, he observed. Fighting that only leads to frustration. So now I plan for it. I save certain books for winter evenings. I make my home more comfortable for longer hours indoors. In spring, I need more connection, more fresh air. So I adjust my routines accordingly. This practice offers a powerful antidote to one of the greatest challenges of living alone, after 65. The sense that time is simply running down, that days are passing without purpose or distinction. By moving consciously with the seasons, you reclaim time as something to be experienced fully rather than merely endured. The seasons no longer pass through me, Walter said simply. I moved with them, and with that movement came meaning. Number 5, prepare for the unexpected with grace. Walter's life had begun to find new rhythms. His mornings at the conservatory, his circle of meaningful connections at Silver Hour, his Sunday legacy project, his seasonal routines. These practices hadn't eliminated his grief or his aloneness, but they had transformed how he carried them. He was living with purpose again, with engagement. And then, unexpectedly, something shifted. Helen Carter, the woman Walter had met through Silver Hour, whose warmth and intelligence had gradually become important to him, announced she was leaving. Her son was getting married in Arizona, Walter explained. He and his fiancée had asked Helen to move closer to them. They had a guest house on their property. It was a wonderful opportunity for her to be part of a family again, to know her future grandchildren. Walter felt genuinely happy for Helen, but he also felt the sharp edge of impending loss. Over the months of nature walks and conversations, Helen's presence had softened the jagged edges of his solitude. There had been nothing romantic between them, just the comfort of mutual recognition, of easy companionship. Before we continue, what's one unspoken lesson you've learned after turning 60? We'd love to read it, back to where we were. We stood together at the train platform on her last day, Walter remembered. The golden evening light was breaking across her face. She was excited about this new chapter, this chance to be close to her son. But there was sadness too, for the community she was leaving, for the routines she'd established. In that moment, Walter faced a choice. He could withdraw to protect himself from the pain of another goodbye. He could make Helen feel guilty about her decision. Or he could meet this unexpected turn with grace, with the wisdom to recognize that loss is inevitable, that attachment always involves risk. I felt my heart tighten, Walter admitted, but I smiled through the ache. I told her, "You gave me back the sound of laughter." It was true, she had. She touched my hand and boarded the train, and just like that, she was gone. Loss again. But this time Walter didn't shatter. He let it hurt, and then he let it pass. That's the strange thing, he reflected. When Eleanor died, I thought I'd never survive another significant loss, but with Helen's departure I discovered I could feel the sadness fully without being consumed by it. I could honor what her friendship had meant without demanding that she stay to keep providing it. This capacity to face the unexpected with grace rather than brittle resistance is essential for anyone living alone in later years. Because the truth is, change continues throughout life. People come and go, health fluctuates, circumstances shift. The ability to bend rather than break in these winds of change is not just a psychological skill, but a spiritual practice. I'd built a life that could absorb this loss, Walter explained. Not because I'd protected myself from caring, but because I'd developed other sources of meaning and connection. Helen's friendship had been a gift, but it wasn't the sole foundation of my well-being. This is the heart of preparing for the unexpected with grace, building a life with multiple centers of meaning rather than placing all your emotional weight on any single relationship or circumstance. It's about developing resilience not through detachment, but through balanced attachment to various sources of value. For you, this might mean cultivating diverse interests and connections, having regular activities that nourish you physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. Creating a life that doesn't depend entirely on any one person or role for its meaning. After Helen left, I added a new practice to my weekly routine, Walter shared. Every Friday I wrote her a letter. Not to mail, just to maintain the connection in my own heart. I told her about my week, about the changes in the conservatory, about my thoughts and questions. Sometimes I imagined her responses. It was a way of honoring what her friendship had meant without clinging to its physical presence. This practice of maintaining internal connection, even when external connection changes, allowed Walter to carry Helen's influence forward without remaining stuck in grief over her absence. The unexpected will happen, Walter advised. People will leave, health will change, plans will fall through. The question isn't how to prevent these things, but how to meet them when they come, with rigidity and resistance, or with the grace that comes from knowing your worth isn't determined by circumstance. Number 6, make peace with quiet. In the months after Helen's departure, Walter continued his established practices, his morning routines, his social connections at Silver Hour, his legacy project, his seasonal activities. But something had shifted in his relationship to the silence of his home. The quiet after Helen left wasn't the same as the silence after Eleanor died, Walter observed. It wasn't filled with that raw, jagged absence. It was softer somehow, like the hush after snowfall. Still noticeable, still sometimes lonely. But not devastating. This difference reflected Walter's evolving relationship with solitude itself. Through his intentional practices, he had begun to distinguish between loneliness, that painful state of feeling disconnected and unseen, and solitude, the condition of being physically alone but internally connected to sources of meaning. One afternoon, about a month after Helen moved away, I found myself near the hospital where Eleanor had received treatment during her illness, Walter recalled. There was a small chapel there, an interfaith space open to anyone needing reflection. I walked in and sat in the back row. The chapel was empty except for Walter. Afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting pools of blue and amber on the worn wooden floor. Walter closed his eyes and simply breathed. I wasn't praying exactly, he explained, not in any formal sense. I was just present. With my breath, with the silence, with the weight of my life, its joys and sorrows, its connections and losses. And I realized something important. I wasn't running from the quiet anymore. This recognition marked a profound shift. In the early days after Eleanor's death, Walter had done everything possible to avoid silence. Keeping the television on constantly, making unnecessary phone calls, even talking aloud to himself just to fill the air with sound. But now, he could sit inside the quiet without panic. He could be present to it without feeling erased by it. I'd learned to befriend the silence, Walter said simply. Not because I preferred it to connection. I still treasured my conversations and activities with others. But because I discovered that peace wasn't something found only in noise or in the presence of others, it came when I no longer feared being with myself. This capacity to make peace with quiet represents perhaps the most profound transformation available to those who find themselves alone after 65. It's the ability to be genuinely at home, in your own company, not resigned to isolation, but comfortable in solitude. Not settling for less, but discovering something different. For you, making peace with quiet might begin with small practices. 5 minutes of sitting in silence before turning on the television. A meal enjoyed without background noise. A walk without earbuds. These moments gradually build the muscle of comfortable solitude, the ability to be present to yourself without immediate distraction. I still have moments of loneliness, Walter acknowledged. Days when I wish for more connection, more touch, more conversation. The difference is that I don't experience these moments as emergencies anymore. They're just part of the landscape, of being human. Feelings that come and go, like weather patterns moving through. This perspective, seeing loneliness as weather rather than climate, allowed Walter to respond to difficult moments with wisdom rather than reactivity. Instead of making desperate phone calls or decisions from a place of panic, he could acknowledge the feeling offer himself compassion, and choose thoughtful actions aligned with his deeper values. One evening, feeling particularly low, I almost called Rachel to guilt her into visiting, Walter confessed. But instead, I sat with the feeling I wrote in my journal. I made myself a proper dinner with a glass of wine. And by the time I went to bed, the acute edge had softened. The next morning I called Rachel, not from need, but from genuine desire to connect. This ability to distinguish between acute emotional need and authentic desire for connection preserved the health of Walter's relationships. His children began to sense that his outreach came from wholeness rather than desperate lack, and gradually they responded with more openness. David started calling more frequently, Walter noted. Not because I demanded it, but because our conversations had become genuine exchanges rather than exercises in caretaking. Rachel began spending one weekend a month with me, bringing her family for Saturday dinners, but also creating space for just the two of us to talk. These changes weren't dramatic transformations. Walter's children remained busy with their own lives. Their visits and calls still happened within the constraints of their other commitments. But the quality of connection deepened precisely because Walter had stopped needing them to rescue him from his aloneness. I realized something important, Walter reflected. My children couldn't give me what I most needed, a sense of purpose, of meaning, of being at home in my own life. That was something I had to build for myself. Once I did, our relationships could flourish within appropriate boundaries. This insight points to a fundamental truth for anyone navigating aloneness. After 65, the most nourishing connections come not from dependency, but from interdependence. Not from emptiness seeking to be filled, but from wholeness seeking to be shared. The chapel became a regular stop for me, Walter said. Once a week I'd sit there for an hour, not out of grief or desperation, but out of appreciation for that quiet space, for the chance to listen to my own heart beating, to feel gratitude for what remained, rather than fixating on what was lost. This practice of regularly entering silence with intention strengthened Walter's capacity for genuine presence, both with himself and with others. It cultivated the inner spaciousness that allowed him to meet life's continuing challenges with equanimity rather than reactivity. Making peace with quiet doesn't mean preferring isolation, Walter clarified. It means finding a center of gravity within yourself that doesn't depend entirely on external voices for stability. Once you have that center, you can move toward others from choice rather than desperate need. Walter's story doesn't end with a dramatic resolution. There is no sudden romantic partnership that solves his aloneness. No children who abandon their lives to care for him. No magical community that erases all sense of solitude. That wouldn't be true to the reality that many face after 65. Instead, Walter's story continues with quiet dignity. He still lives in his senior co-living apartment. He still wakes each morning to coffee by the window. He still visits the conservatory, attends Silver Hour, writes in his journal, and aligns his activities with the changing seasons. He still experiences moments of loneliness, still misses Eleanor's presence beside him in bed, still wishes sometimes for more frequent connection. But something fundamental has changed. Walter has learned to carry his aloneness with grace rather than desperation, to find meaning within it rather than despite it, to build a life that honors what has been lost while remaining open to what might still emerge. David and Rachel visit more often now, Walter shared, not because I manipulated them with guilt, but because our time together has become genuinely enjoyable. There's a new gentleness in their voices when they call, a recognition of me as a whole person, not just an aging father who needs checking on. This shift in his family relationships didn't happen overnight. It evolved gradually as Walter himself transformed, as he became less emotionally dependent on his children's attention and more grounded in his own practices of meaning-making. Last month, Rachel brought her teenage daughter to stay with me for a weekend while she attended a conference, Walter said, evident pride in his voice. Not because she had no other options, but because Emily specifically asked to come. We played chess and walked to the conservatory together. She helped me write that week's entry in my legacy journal. It was unexpected, lovely. These moments of connection, authentic, freely chosen, unforced, have become more frequent in Walter's life. Not because he demands them or arranges his days in desperate anticipation of them, but precisely because he has built a life that doesn't depend on them for its fundamental value. Helen writes monthly, Walter added, real letters with photographs of Arizona sunsets and stories about her son's garden. I write back with news of the conservatory and silver hour. There's no expectation of her return, no painful yearning. In our correspondence, just the continuation of a friendship that mattered to us both. This capacity to maintain connection across distance and circumstance reflects Walter's growth. He can now hold relationships as valuable without clinging to them, can appreciate their presence without demanding permanence. The greatest change, though, isn't in Walter's external circumstances. It's in his internal landscape, in how he experiences his own company, his own life. Sometimes in the evening, I'll put on one of Eleanor's favorite pieces of music, Walter shared. I'll close my eyes and let the memories come. But they're not only sad memories anymore, there's sweetness too, gratitude for what we shared. And then I open my eyes and return to this present moment, to my home as it is now, to my life as it continues to unfold. This ability to honor the past without being trapped in it, to acknowledge loss without being defined by it, speaks to a profound spiritual maturity. Walter has learned what many never do, regardless of their circumstances, that life is a continuous process of becoming, of growth and adaptation, right until its final moments. I'm not waiting anymore, Walter said simply, not for rescue, not for things to return to how they were before, not even for some ideal future state where everything feels resolved. I'm just living each day as it comes, finding meaning where I can create it. This stance, this fundamental choice to engage with life as it is, rather than as we wish it were, offers wisdom for anyone facing aloneness after 65. Because the truth is, none of us knows how many days remain. To spend them in waiting, in resistance, in bitter comparison to what once was, this is to miss the possibility still present, even within constraint. What about you? As you consider Walter's journey, his practices of reclaiming mornings, curating meaningful connections, creating a legacy project, adopting seasonal routines, preparing for the unexpected with grace, and making peace with quiet, what resonates with your own experience? What practices might help you transform emptiness into meaning, isolation into dignified solitude? Perhaps you're just beginning to navigate aloneness after decades of partnership, or maybe you've been alone for years but find yourself struggling with new limitations of aging. Wherever you find yourself on this path, Walter's story offers not a precise map, but a compass, a set of principles that can orient you toward meaning even when the terrain feels unfamiliar. Which of these practices might you begin tomorrow? A simple morning ritual that reclaims the first hour of your day as intentional rather than reactive. A step toward regular social contact, even if it begins with the small recognition of familiar faces at a cafe or library. The first entry in a journal that might one day speak to future generations about what you've learned, what you've loved, what you've seen in this remarkable world. Start small. Start now. Start where you are, with what you have. Remember that this journey isn't about erasing aloneness, but about transforming how you carry it. Not about filling every moment with activity or connection, but about finding peace within the quiet spaces. Not about returning to what was, but about creating what might still be. The poet Mary Oliver asks, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" This question doesn't expire at 65 or 75 or 85. It remains present, urgent, worthy of our attention at every stage, even, perhaps especially, when we find ourselves alone. Walter continues his daily walk to the conservatory. He notices new blooms, changing light, the rhythm of seasons. He writes in his journal each Sunday. He teaches chess to newcomers at silver hour. He calls his children without expectation. He sits in quiet chapels and listens to his own breath. He lives, not despite his aloneness, but within it, with dignity, with purpose, with the wisdom to know that meaning isn't something we find, but something we create. "There are still hard days," Walter acknowledged. "Still moments when I wish for more touch, more immediate connection. I don't want to paint some falsely rosy picture. But those moments no longer define me. They're just weather passing through, clouds that move across an otherwise clear sky." This perspective, this ability to see difficult emotions as temporary states rather than permanent identities, is perhaps the most valuable wisdom Walter offers, not because it eliminates pain, but because it places pain in a larger context. A context that includes joy, peace, purpose, and connection, even within the reality of living alone. So what will you do with this one wild and precious life that continues to unfold, regardless of who remains beside you? How will you reclaim your mornings, cultivate meaningful connections, create something that outlasts this moment, move with the seasons, meet the unexpected with grace, make peace with quiet? These questions aren't theoretical. They're invitations to begin, today, tomorrow, the next day, creating a life of meaning within whatever circumstances you face. To transform aloneness from a sentence into an opening, from an ending into a different kind of beginning. Walter's story isn't over. Neither is yours. There are blank pages still waiting to be filled, not with what was or what might have been, but with what is and what might still emerge. With practices that dignify this day, this life, this continuing journey of becoming. What will you write on those pages? How will you begin? Thanks for watching. Every day we share stories that speak to the heart. Subscribe and join us. What's one lesson this story reminded you of? I'd love to read about it in the comments.